Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to What It Takes to Overcome Imposter Syndrome. This is the fifth talk in this year's What It Takes Alumni Speaker Series for our 2021-22 academic year. I'm Caroline Lloyd. I'm Director of Student and Academic Services here at the University of Westminster. I lead teams that deliver a whole variety of student services, including our Careers and Employability Service. And we work very closely with the alumni team and indeed with our alumni around careers and employability and offering lots of opportunities such as the What It Takes series to our current students, recent graduates and of course colleagues as well. I am really particularly delighted to be hosting this evening's event on what it takes to overcome imposter syndrome. As when I came across this concept a few years ago, it really was transformational for me, both in terms of my work and also my personal life. I think the more that I learned about it, the more I could recognise in myself imposter syndrome, and so the more I could develop techniques to recognise it and to recognise when it was impacting me and kind of develop tools to be able to manage that and also learn to be kind to myself. It's very much an ongoing process, but for me, being able to identify it and name it has just been so powerful. And I'm very excited to hear from Caron and to learn more from her and from all of you at this evening's talk. Before I introduce Caron, there's just a few housekeeping things that I'd like to mention, and some of those have come up in the chat already, but just to recap. So the talk is being recorded. It will be edited and made available on YouTube when it's ready, and we'll send you the link. Your cameras and your microphones are automatically turned off, but the live chat is on. And the group chat is there for you to ask questions to our speaker. We've got a great team of moderators this evening, and they'll be collating your questions throughout the talk, and then I'll put those to Caron at the end. If you would prefer, you can use the personal message, private message function to contact the moderators directly with your questions. So if you prefer not to put a question in the group chat, that's absolutely fine. Just send it through as a PM to one of the moderators. And also, just so that you're aware, even though live chat is on and we are recording, as I say, the live recording that ends up on YouTube won't pick up any of your usernames or anything that's been put into the chat. And when I put the questions to Caron later, I will do that anonymously. You might want to change your notification settings to stop the sound and the pop-up notifications, and you can do that by clicking on the purple button in the bottom right-hand corner, going to settings and the notification section. So I'll move on to introduce Caron, who we are, as I say, so delighted is joining us this evening. And Caron Bradshaw will be sharing her insights into what it takes to overcome imposter syndrome. Since completing her Law LLB at Westminster in 1993, Caron is now an award-winning Chief Executive of the Charity Finance Group, where she has worked since 2010. Caron is also a trained barrister and has a wide array of experience across charity, regulation and law, policy, member support and professional ethics. She has been recognised for several awards in the charity and finance sectors, and most recently honoured with an OBE for her services to charity in the New Year's Honours List for 2021. During this talk, Caron will look at defining imposter syndrome, what it is and what it isn't, and she will also discuss the importance of recognising your own strengths and leaning into them, and recounting what she has learned from her own career journey and experience. This talk will provide insight and advice on how you can build confidence when you're feeling anything but confident, and what you should do when it's not really imposter syndrome that you're experiencing, but bullying or oppression of some form. Caron will do her presentation and then I'll come back online and ask your questions to her. So just a reminder, do pop questions into the chat, either the group chat or directly to moderators as we go along and as things occur to you. So Caron, I'm going to hand over to you and hope that you're ready to switch your camera on. Thank you very much.
Now I have my camera on, so I'm hoping that you can see me.
Yes, I can see you. I think all is good.
Great. When you said, I hope you'll switch your camera on, I'm thinking, oh no, I thought my camera was on. Okay, let's pull my files up. My slides up. Right, are they coming through? Share now.
Not seeing them yet, but it might take a moment.
Loading up now. Is that coming up now?
Yep,
there
I can see those. That's all good.
Super. All right. Well, thank you ever so much for having me. Believe it or not, I'm sitting here with my little ticker going at 10 to the dozen, feeling quite sort of nervous and anxious about speaking because I don't consider myself an expert on this. I'm bringing my own personal experience and journey to the table. I'm not a researcher. I don't have books under my belt on leadership and on imposter syndrome. Others have. And so obviously you can probably hear in the background of what I'm saying that there is a slight self-doubt that is there present as I start to talk to you about the topic. I hope that what I'm going to be able to do during this is take you through some various areas and elements that potentially make up what we've heard, what we've come to know as imposter syndrome. Oh, my slides have just gone off again. Hang on. And walk you through some of my experiences, my opinions. They are my opinions. Others may have different views. And also, I just want to challenge you. Can you see my slides still? Because they keep popping off.
I can't see them at the moment. They were up. Yep, they're back now, Caron.
Right,
yep, and we've got that first one. Yeah.
Good. It might be that it's timed out and thought that I was playing silly pools. So, okay. So I'm going to start with what is imposter syndrome. And these two ladies, in looking at this area, these are the two ladies that are the producers, if you like, of the seminal work around what imposter syndrome is. They are two psychotherapists, I think their backgrounds, they're academics. Lady on the left is Pauline Clance and the woman on the right is Suzanne Imes. And their work has been around since the 70s and then into the 80s. And it's helped us unpack some of the things that I think, as I start to talk about what makes this up, will resonate with you, and certainly have resonated with me, and listening to you, Caroline, have resonated with you as well. And you found them very transformational. A lot of the research in the early days said that it was mostly women that experienced imposter syndrome, but as time has gone on, we have had more evidence to show that increasingly men also experience imposter syndrome, both men and women that experience it. And if you Google imposter syndrome, you will be inundated with training and consultancy and support and various other conferences and bits and pieces to help you overcome this imposter syndrome that we've grown to identify with. And what I'm going to come on to later on, I want to just challenge that a little bit, because I think a lot of what I've come across and what has manifested itself to me as imposter syndrome, of the feeling of not fitting in, is about my inability to accept failure, my culture and environment that I've been working in, which I'll share some stories with you there, about being in a very male-dominated environment. Accountancy was a very male-dominated environment when I started my career there, about the lack of diversity and the way that can impact upon the way that we feel in the workplace. And also, as Caroline said, I'll touch on the difference between, frankly, when you're being bullied and it's external and not internal, where you're feeling that level of anxiety and imposter syndrome. So again, if you Google this, you'll get all sorts of different phrases that pop up. Broadly, they are around doubting your ability and feeling like a fraud, so feeling out of depth, feeling like you don't belong in a particular environment, thinking about that internal experience of believing that you're just not as competent as other people perceive you to be. And that sort of psychological pattern in which, as an individual, you doubt your skills, your talent, your accomplishments, that you have this persistent, almost paralyzing internal fear that someone's going to find you out, that you're going to be exposed as a fraud. And these are words that I suspect resonate with you. So let me just pause for a moment and see. Do pop into the chat. Are these things that you feel, that you doubt your ability, that you are not competent, that you're going to be? Yeah. So yes, 100%. This is how you are feeling. Now let me move on. There are all sorts of different bits and pieces that both these ladies have created, but one of these I thought was really resonant with me and has manifested itself in the workplace for me many, many times, and when I was studying actually, where you have this overriding self-doubt and anxiety that just totally either paralyzes you so that you just keep pushing that piece of work around until the very deadline, like a piece of cold broccoli on your plate that you just don't want to touch. Or you go the opposite way, where you work so hard on something that you just never get quite out of the blocks and never quite get beyond that researching and prep and that side of things. And then when you do manage to finally, at that very 11th hour, get the piece of work in, that sort of overwhelming feeling of relief. And if you happen to have bluffed your way through and managed to get a decent grade at the end of it, or that somebody thinks that what you're doing is a good piece of work and gives you praise or gives you accolade for it, that you suddenly feel this sort of overwhelming, oh no, don't give me that. And it becomes this sort of cycle. And seeing this imposter syndrome cycle that IMS created, I found really, really resonant. I would definitely suggest that you do go on to also Pauline Clancy's website, and she's got within there something that she calls Clancy's imposter phenomenon scale, and it asks you a load of different questions, and you fill out you'll mark yourself on the various different things, and it will give you a score. And I come out as moderately moderately an imposter, even now when I've got so many things that are under my belt as positive accolades or positive contributions to my CV, as it were. So I'm going to read you out a couple of these and just see what you think. I can give the impression that I am more competent than I really am. How does that sit with some of you? When people praise me for something I've accomplished, I'm afraid I won't be able to live up to their expectations in the future. I tend to remember the incidents in which I have not done my best more than the times that I've done my best. And I can see in the chat that people are asking about the links to websites, etc. I will make sure that I give you all the various links, etc., so that those can be passed on to you to have a look. But that last one particularly, this zoning in on the things that you've done badly. I do quite a lot of speaking, and we used to have quite a lot of evaluation forms back. And I remember when I was working at the Institute of Chartered Accountants, getting back some feedback from a session that I'd done, and I'd come off stage actually for once feeling, oh, I really nailed that. I did good on that. Felt really proud of myself. And then I looked at the evaluation feedback forms, and sure enough, there were lots of really positive comments, really, really brilliant things. And it was my eyes settled on the one that said, worst speaker I've ever seen. Boring, dull, the really negative comments. And a similar thing happened to me when I started at CFG. The previous CEO had been called Keith. And one of the sets of feedback after one of the first speaking engagements I gave said, bring back Keith. Now, these are the sorts of things that your eyes zone in on. Never mind the 9s and the 10s and this was great and really helpful, thank you. Your eyes zone in on the ones that say, that was pants. Does that resonate with you? Is that where you find yourself coming into the negative experiences and not the personal, not the positive experiences? Yeah, I can see people. Oh, wonderful! Caroline shared the website for Pauline Clance. Brilliant, thank you. So you've got this sort of conversion of different things where we have anxiety and self-doubt that might paralyze us or make us over-prepare. We've got different elements where our minds are brought to the negative side and not the positive side of things. And then you've got Imes, who talks about different elements of imposter syndrome. And she talks about there being this imposter cycle where you have this sort of paralysis, the need to be special or the best at something. It's not good enough to just be up there with the top. You have to be really, you know, the top of the list. Characteristics of Superman or Superwoman, where you feel like you're able to do, or you should be able to do, absolutely everything and anything. Fear of failure, denial of your own ability, and discounting any praise that you get, and feeling fear and guilt about success. And if you have 2 of 6 of those different elements, she says you've got imposter syndrome. And I think probably all of you will say, well, I've got at least 2, if not 3, at some point. It doesn't have to be all the time. It's just at some point. So let's move on. So let's look at who suffers from imposter syndrome. So while I was looking at this, preparing for this event, one of the things that I kind of came across was that some data said that 2 out of 5 people suffer with imposter syndrome, in that they don't enjoy their successes. They just absolutely can't celebrate their successes. This next bit, 30% more, 30% more might think that they're a fraud. And 30% more people with self-doubt. Now, those last 2 statistics are absolutely made up. I just literally made those up. And the reason I made them up is because I believe everyone at some point suffers from some level of imposter syndrome. We either have, on the one end, the real paralyzing anxiety that needs medical and psychological support, but everyone at some point in their life will have that feeling of, I don't belong, I'm not good enough, I can't succeed, someone's going to find me out, I don't fit in. All of these negative narratives are words that I think all of us have experienced at some point. How do people feel about that? Is that resonating? Would you agree that at some point in your life, every single one of you and everyone that you know has felt some self-doubt? Yeah. So let's talk about that self-doubt, because I think sometimes that self-doubt is not something that is coming from within. In fact, the more I've looked at this, the more I have come to the conclusion that this is our response to the environment in which we are operating. And I've noticed, I'm not keeping an eye completely on the question that are appearing, but I have noticed the letters BAME, BAME are up there. And what I would say to you, and what I'm going to challenge us to think about, is whether or not actually this is about imposter syndrome, or whether it is us responding to an environment that is set up to reward certain parts of society and penalise other parts of society. And in particular, when we talk about confidence, for example, whether the expression of confidence by, say, a cis white man is going to be received in the same way as confidence expressed by a black woman. So I really want us to challenge some of this thinking about whether imposter syndrome is about what comes from inside, or whether it's the way in which we respond to the circumstances around us. And that can be individual events where somebody has really put you down. So, for example, when I was doing my A-levels, I completely flunked them. I didn't work hard enough. I just coasted, frankly, and I flunked all of them. And I went to see my head of sixth form, and he said to me, "Caron, you're not academic. Go and work in a bank or something. This isn't really for you." And I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I'd had a vision of being a barrister from as long as I can remember. I represented my dad at a planning tribunal at 15. That's how convinced I was that I wanted to practice law. And this earth-shattering, I'm not going to get the A-levels to get me into uni, and then this, you mustn't do this, you must give up. I very nearly did. And the only reason I didn't was because I had a fantastic individual who was a friend, a couple of years younger, that I'd started the sixth form again to resit my A-levels, and she held me in there and said, you can do this, you can do this. And I'll come back to that theme a little bit later. So I want you to, if you can, just pop into the chat a sentence or two of a time when you have felt a fraud or an imposter. And I'll start you off with, so you get a feel for what I mean. When I was appointed the CEO of CFG, I really genuinely felt like it was luck that had got me there. And at every point for the first 6 months or so, I thought, I'm going to be found out. So give me just 1 or 2 lines. If you're prepared to share those, don't worry if you're not. Just 1 or 2 lines of a time. Just think about a time that you have felt like an imposter. Just give you a few moments to share. Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing those. They're starting to come through. Fantastic. Thank you. And the reason for doing that is so you can see from each other how many of you are feeling the same way that you have felt. Now, obviously, you're a self-selected audience. Would you be in the room for a talk on imposter syndrome if you felt totally confident all the time? Probably not. But I want you to realise how widespread this sense of feeling not worthy can be, particularly amongst us. So before I move on, I want to share with you a couple of stories. So the first one is a time in my life where I was working at a place, an employment place. I'm going to try very carefully, as this is recorded, not to share who or when. And I had my boss's boss, at an away day, phone me up in the middle of the night and ask if he could visit me in my bedroom. And of course, I told him that I was not interested. And the next day, he was stuck to my side like glue, being all sort of nervous and, oh, I don't know what I said last night. I must have been so drunk. And I was quite happy just to let that go. That was not appropriate, but it was what it was, and I was quite happy to let it go. But he was obviously very, very concerned about what I would do with this situation, and systematically for about 6 months undermined my work with anyone and everyone that he possibly could. And I found it cripplingly distressing and anxiety-inducing. I was so concerned that I was going to lose my job, particularly as some of the activities had set me up to basically fail. Now, I've looked back on that situation and wondered many times whether it was imposter syndrome that had caused me to have that sort of feelings of self-doubt, and whether I was a fraud and whether I actually fitted in there. But I'm absolutely convinced actually that was me responding naturally to the negative stimulus that I was being put under, and that it was the environment that was bringing out that trauma in me. The second example I'm going to give you, when I was at, and I'm happy to say this one because I've spoken publicly about this before. About 3 years into CFG as the CEO, I had finished 3 years strategy, and I had been given quite a lot of accolades. People had seen really positive results. They'd seen the membership numbers increase, the income increase, our reputation was going up, and I was being told by a lot of people, just bag that credit and get yourself another job, climb the ladder, your career ladder, take this, bank it. And I felt very strongly that if I walked away from the organisation knowing that there were an awful lot of system issues, structural issues, problems that needed to be addressed, that I would be simply passing on a problem to somebody else, and I wouldn't have done my job at all if I went knowing that those things needed to be resolved. And so I set about convincing my board to go through a huge program of change. And I sat down with them and gave them the warts and all. This is what it's going to look like. This potentially is the worst case scenario. Long story short, every time I turned over a rock after we had been given permission to go ahead, I found another problem. And we didn't quite hit the £180,000 worst case scenario that I said that we could hit, but near as 167,000. And much of it was around accounting problems, not irregularities or improprieties, but problems. And my organisation stands for great financial management. So the worst possible thing that my organisation could do is fail at doing its finances well. Long story short, I had a complete and utter breakdown. I burnt myself out, and I was off work for a good 3 months before I managed to return. Now, the reason I'm sharing that is because during that period of time, I had loads of the elements that I mentioned earlier of imposter syndrome. So that fear of failure, the characteristics of Superman, Superwoman, thinking that you have to do everything, you must do everything, you've got to be best at everything. All of those areas really kicked in to me, and I was absolutely crippled by this notion of needing to succeed and fearing failure, thinking that I would lose my house, my home, everything as a result of not getting this right. Now I'm going to ask you, having recounted both those stories, tell me, was that my internal imposter syndrome, or was that me as a natural human being reacting to a really pressured, difficult situation? I'm going to pause for a moment and just see what your thoughts are. Yeah. So with your own situations, think about those times that you have thought of yourself as suffering from imposter syndrome, feeling self-doubt, feeling like a fraud, and just reflect for a moment on those. Was it something that was welling up inside you, or was it you responding to some external pressures? Really challenge yourself on this, because I think that we can sometimes be told this is something that's wrong with you, as opposed to this is you naturally as a human being responding to a situation in which you are feeling pressure and feeling significant challenge. So on that note, I want you to pause and consider yourselves. What makes you you? What about your academic aspirations and your achievements? Think about your ethnicity, your gender, your sexual orientation, perhaps your class, whether you are able-bodied or not, whether or not you have an accent, how you speak. What are the things that make you you? Now you've thought a little bit about that, tell me, and this is very important, that this is about what you think. Do you think those are things you have to overcome, or are they, i.e. they're a burden to you, or are they things that you feel you celebrate? Pop in the chat. Is it a burden, or do you celebrate these things as strengths? There's quite a few people feeling a mixture of both, that it's sometimes they feel that they can celebrate it and sometimes they feel it's a burden. So the example I'm going to give you about me, I'm an emotional person. I even cried today in a one-to-one. One of my wonderful staff said something that was deeply moving to me, and it made me well up. She felt incredibly embarrassed and said, "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't want to upset you." And I had to say, I don't feel upset. I feel moved, and it's different. Thank you for moving me in that way. And I'm an emotional person, and I'm not going to worry about the fact that I'm emotional, but it hasn't always been that way. I have had people say to me in meetings, "You are too emotional." How many of you have had something like that said to you? You're too loud, you're too quiet, you're too emotional, you're too this or that. So much, yeah. The motive of the person saying it is always, I'd say, 99.9%, sometimes it's clumsy, but more often than not, it is said to put you down, to make you feel less than, to make you feel like you are not actually worthy of a seat at the table, or that you're an imposter. And that's why I said at the beginning, I want to come back to what is this working environment that we live in. And I'm going to suggest to you, and I feel that I have to kind of quantify this, that it's about environment. It's about the patriarchy. It's about systems that have been pulled together that support particular characteristics and particular types. This is the place in which we live. This is post-war command control types of leadership. And this is not against men. Men do not work well in toxic masculinity either. It's toxic to both parties. It's toxic to both men and women. So I really want us to think about whether or not, when we're talking about imposter syndrome, whether we really are talking about something that's inherent and inside, or whether we are actually talking about difficult circumstances that we are trying to wrestle with, and with systemic structures that are designed, and they are designed to favour parts of society and not to favour other parts of society. So let's move on. This is an article that I saw back in February, which is rather, I think, actually, I'm going to pause there because I've just seen what about toxic femininity. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as toxic femininity. I think what you might be referencing is thinking about the word that often gets used is the feminazi, or not being, being too over the top about female rights. I don't think you can be too over the top about female rights, and I think that we do have to be really careful about language, because it's the sorts of Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, men violence against women. What about women's violence against men? Misogyny, misandry. We need to be really careful about the whataboutism. We need to be really careful about that, because I think that if you reflect on society, it's almost incontrovertible that we have a society that has been post-war set up in a very particular way to favour particular characteristics, and that time is starting to shift, and it doesn't serve any of us, which is why I said that I think toxic masculinity is bad for men too. So apologies for being sidelined by that, but I just saw it out the corner of my eye. So this article I thought was a really interesting one, and I commend it to you. And it talks to some of the comments that I was just making about what sets us apart being used against us, and thinking about leaning into some of the things that we have in the past had used against us. So I gave you the example of being emotional. I've had that used against me as for being too emotional. I've heard other people be told off for being too unemotional, being too sort of professional. So I think that we have to think about the ways in which we are made up and how we operate, and we have to be very careful not to assume that this imposter syndrome is coming from inside. So think about the ways in which you are talked to and talked about, whether or not you're strategic enough, whether you have enough gravitas, whether you are professional enough. And and other things like team building happening at times or places which are inaccessible to you for whatever reason, be it a pub and that's against your faith, or whether it's in an inaccessible area where you can't access as a non-able-bodied person. There are structural inequalities that we have to be alive to if we are going to build a fairer society, and I think that we have to really think about those. How are we doing for time? Right. So I'm a huge watcher of TED. I love TED, and I think that we have to expand our horizons, listen to people's experiences and opinions, even if we don't agree with them. Take from them what is helpful to us, what serves us, and let go stuff that doesn't serve us. So I would like to commend to you these 4 individuals. There are a plethora of others, but these I particularly love. So I'll start from left and I'll go across and I'll whiz through them. So Amy Cuddy, absolutely adore this woman's TED Talks around confidence. If you Google "fake it till you make it," it's a brilliant TED Talk. And without being too much of a spoiler, I do feel like I need to share some of the sort of headlines from it. So she was an academic, very, very bright. That was how she identified for herself as being a hugely bright and academic individual. And she suffered a head injury that totally robbed her of her identity as an academically gifted individual. And she's done a lot of work, ended up going through Harvard, overcoming and rebuilding her intellectual prowess, but along the way, really, really seriously got stuck on, I shouldn't be here, I'm a fraud. She really suffered from significant imposter syndrome brought about by responding to that trauma. So this is the first of my sort of tips, is shamelessly stolen from Amy. She talks about the power of our physical posture. So for example, when we're feeling confident, we open up. And when we're feeling scared or frightened or insignificant, we close down. And before many a meeting, you will find me stood in a toilet doing a 2-minute power pose to lift and build my confidence. Or when I manned the telephones for complaints at the Institute of Chartered Accountants, if somebody was getting very heavy with me or aggressive, or I was feeling unable to kind of occupy the space, I was feeling lacking in confidence, I would stand up while I was in the telephone call. And the difference in that physical posturing to my mental state of being was huge. So I really, really commend to you Amy Cuddy. She's fantastic. Does anyone know Amy Cuddy or come across her before? Yeah. If you haven't, look her up. She's great. The second person who I absolutely love, I've seen her speak, she's hysterically funny as well, is Brené Brown. And she talks a lot about vulnerability. But the one that I would suggest that you watch is the one about shame. And she talks about shame and that she didn't learn about vulnerability from studying vulnerability. She learned about vulnerability through studying shame. And that shame that prevents us from really occupying a space very positively. One of the things I absolutely love about what she talks about is that vulnerability is not a weakness. So all these feelings that we feel when we're gripped by imposter syndrome, of self-doubt, that we're a fraud, etc., these are vulnerable feelings. These are us feeling less than. And she's brilliant. She's written some fantastic books, and I commend them to you. I think you'll love them. And one of the lines from that TED Talk is that she talks about inviting people to walk into shame, into the, kind of like a woodland of shame, but not to make a home there and set up home and camp out, but rather to be able to understand what shame does to us, and that the fear of failure or the shame of failure is significant I think in this concept of imposter syndrome. And she also talks about the power that people who are watching and criticizing and judging can bring to a scenario that then triggers shame and that imposter syndrome piece within us. The third lady is Brittany Packnett. If you've not come across her, again, watch her TED Talk. I particularly like the one on how you build your confidence. She's an activist and an educator, and I absolutely adore some of the messages in the TED Talk that she has. And there's a couple of lines I'm going to kind of share with you about that. And she talks about that we have more resource and knowledge now than we ever have had, but we still have inequity. Why do we still have inequity? And her argument is that the potency of confidence, or the lack of it, and what that does to power is significant. And what she says is that in order to be confident, you need three things. You need to have permission, you have to have community, and you have to have curiosity. She also talks about you can't be it unless you can see it. So there is something about power dynamics and being able to share space and see diverse workplaces and environments that helps us all become more confident and more resourceful. So she's brilliant, and I would recommend you see her. And then the last one you might have come across as well, Nick Vujicic. He's a wonderful individual. He's an Australian, I think he is. But he does a lot of talk around life with no limbs and no limits. He talks about the self-doubt that he had, and the feelings of being suicidal, as he reflecting on the fact that he thought he would never marry, he'd never hold his girlfriend's hand, he'd never have children, he'd never be able to run and play football. And if you watch his various different videos, he's an inspirational speaker, you will see that he does all of those things. He's married with 2 kids, he plays football, he lives life to the full. But his self-doubt came from people telling him, poor you won't be able to do this because you don't have limbs. You can't do that because you aren't fitting our normal paradigm of what we think society expects. But there is a preferred archetype, an architecture of leadership, and we do reward or penalise people on whether they fit that. And I really honestly believe that. As I say, it's my opinion, my view, but I genuinely, from the years that I've spent in the workplace, I believe that is the biggest problem that we have to overcome, not our own imposter syndrome. So let's move on. My tips for overcoming imposter syndrome. The first one is adopt a growth mindset. Do you know what I mean by a growth mindset? Can I just have a few comments? What do you think a growth mindset is? There's a couple of no's, so I will go through this. So for me, a growth mindset is about the fact that you see failure as a genuine option. It's not a problem to overcome. That failure is something that gives you an opportunity for growth and for learning. That feedback that you receive is really positive, even when it feels like it's negative. And the example I'd give you there is I've had some feedback while we were through the pandemic from my staff about how I dealt with a particular communication around the payment of furlough, for example. And it was given to me in a very emotional, very hurt, very what appeared to be unhelpful and non-constructive way. But actually, the core message was absolutely right. The challenge was absolutely right. And my growth mindset enabled me to go, ouch, that hurt, but actually there's some diamonds in this dirt. So let's let the stuff that is sitting around this feedback go, and let's look at what the message is within the feedback. And that was really, really helpful to me. It also is about trying new things and feeling positive. So going back to what Brittany was saying, that permission to fail, permission to do things is really important. And the fixed mindset, on the contrary, is where failure is about a personal reflection of your own abilities, that you can't change your abilities, that you can't change things around you, that outcomes are predetermined. So growth mindset, absolutely. Whenever you get anything given to you, think about what you can learn from it. I mentioned my breakdown. I would not go without that experience if you paid me £1 million. I learned so much through it. I don't want to repeat it, but I learned so much from that experience that it absolutely transformed my life. I feel completely different as a result of having that breakdown, and I have described it before as being a breakthrough. So I think that is because I view things as everything being an experience now to go through it. My daughter bought me a little placard. Life is not about waiting for the rain to stop. It's about learning to dance in the rain, or something along those lines. And it's absolutely right. This is the growth mindset that you need. Right, let's whiz through because I think I might be running out of time. So the second one is focus on what you can control. This is from Stephen Covey. This is his circle of control, influence, and concern. If you think of this as a fixed outer edge, and where your attention goes is what expands. So if you think about the things you are concerned about, and you squeeze the space that's available for those things you can influence or control, then all your energy is going on what you can't control. So this conversely is, if you think about what you can control and what you can influence, the space for the things that concern you that are beyond your control gets squeezed. And this is a really positive thing, particularly around the imposter syndrome piece. Break it down as to what can you control, what can you influence, and what is beyond your control that's only concerning you. Going back to what makes you you, don't celebrate, don't overcome. View those things that make you you as a superpower. I know that's a really difficult thing to say because we've just talked about systemic and structural disadvantage, but that isn't you, that's the outside environment. Focus on what makes you you and how you can use it so that you feel in flow, that you are enough, because you are enough. You are enough. I feel in flow not because I've stopped being emotional, but because I've just gone with it. That's who I am. I talk about love now. I feel my purpose in the workplace is to bring love into the workplace, and that's a really controversial concept, and people sort of look strangely at you when you talk about love and work. But I've lent into it. That's who I am. Not everyone's going to like it. Not everyone's going to agree with me, and that's absolutely fine. But you are enough. Find your ability to celebrate who you are and what makes you you. So on that theme of love yourself and love others. There is a good reason why the air hostess or host steward says, put your mask on first. You cannot help others if you are passed out in the aisle. So look after yourself. This is not an indulgence. This is a necessity. Love yourself and you will be able to love others and get more out of other people. And that means loving yourself wholly, accepting that you are perfectly imperfect, wonderful in your flaws, and that you are enough. I love this. It's a book by Don Ruiz Miguel. Sorry, my my throat just dried up then. These are his 4 agreements. He talks about being impeccable with your word, not making assumptions, not taking things personally, and always doing your best. I'm not going to read out what's on the slide. We are sort of up against it, I think, time-wise, but I believe you'll get this slide deck. But I strongly advise you to get the book. It is written in a very interesting manner. I think English is probably not his first language, and it's very faith and spiritually based, but the messaging of it is absolutely wonderful. Please read it. It's lovely. It's such a gorgeous read. And then my top tips. I haven't talked much about a coach and a mentor, but to go back to the community piece, please think about the fact that you need a community around you. You cannot be vulnerable without safety. You can only be safe if you have people around you that will hold you and will support you. I've just had a message to say I've got a bit more time, so I'll stop whizzing through. Coaching and mentoring, I have for the last 15 years had either or both a coach or a mentor, and I would strongly recommend them to you. I have found them to be able to unlock my thinking, to give me a safe space to work through things. A lot of people ask what's the difference between a coach and a mentor. Well, I'd say if you had a Venn diagram, the vast majority of coaching and mentoring sits in the same space. The bit that sets it apart is a coach will probably never give you an answer. They'll say the answers within you, and they'll ask you questions to help you work through and get your answers for yourself. And most of the time, 99.9% of the time, the information is inside you. You do have the answers. A mentor, on the other hand, will more often say, well, here's my experience. Here's a story I can tell you about what's happened to me. and may give you some advice and may give you the ability to sort of open into other networks and connections and help you in that way. But both have absolute worth their weight in gold, and I found them really, really useful. Cut yourself some slack. You know, the number of times I have beaten myself up not for achieving something, going back to my story about speaking and having those marks, the one that said, bring back Keith, it will stick with me to the day I die. I will always think, oh, they don't like me, but it was one person's opinion. Also be vulnerable. Be able to say to somebody, I need some help. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's strength. Have the courage to ask for help. But here is another side to that. You often will hear Brené Brown talk about vulnerability and authenticity. And what she'll say is authenticity is not a free pass to be horrible to other people. I'm having a bad day. I'm giving you both barrels. That's not what this is about. Vulnerability isn't about wailing and gnashing and pulling your hair out. It's about saying, I got that wrong, I need some help, or I'm feeling scared, I need some support, or anything along that spectrum. I feel shamed because I didn't get that right. That's what vulnerability is about. Take time to understand your drivers and those of the people that you work with. I've got a wonderful book upstairs that I'm halfway through called Surrounded by Idiots. And essentially it's saying that everyone else that isn't you feels like an idiot to you because they are operating in a different way. Their minds process information in a different way. Getting to know what makes other people work and drive and what's important to them not only gives you the ability to understand how you can couch things in a way that is most likely to cut through them, and I don't mean in a manipulative way, but it also oils the wheels, the bits that hold you when you're going through a pandemic and the floor has fallen out of your income like my organisation has, is the human connections, the human, we all want to succeed. It's the hanging together. It's the understanding. No, you know, I know that your uncle's just died with COVID. You take as much time as you need. It's that human connection that drives us all. We are all human beings first and foremost. Read a lot. Read insatiably. Even stuff that you don't really like, because I think that only by exposing ourselves to other people's opinions and thoughts can we expand our minds and can we start thinking about things in a more critical way. And groupthink does nothing. Diversity does everything. And diversity of thought gives us better decisions. So expose yourself to other people's points of view. Even if you don't agree with it, understand. My nan used to say to me, your mouth and your ears are in that ratio for a good reason, i.e. you listen more, you speak less. And I think it's true. We should listen to understand another person's point of view, not to reply. And often we are in the grip of, I'm listening to reply. I've already formulated what I'm going to say to you before you've even finished your conversation with me. Self-doubt is natural. It's natural. I was literally sitting here climbing the walls as we were about to start. My heart was going 10 to the dozen. And I'm now sitting here as we come towards the end of it thinking, did they like me? Was anything that I said of any use? Are people offended by anything I've said? Have I said anything difficult or awful? Or, you know, I'm going to be doing that and I'll be laying awake probably later on thinking, oh, I could have said that better, or why didn't I give them that? Or, oh, I didn't say this. So we're all sometimes in the grip of fear. And what I would say to you is feel the fear and do it anyway. Do it anyway. Confidence is a muscle and you can train it. The more you behave like you're confident, the more that you lean into it, the more you feel confidence. And this isn't about lacking authenticity. This is about leaning into who you actually are and not self-limiting, not saying I can't, I won't, I mustn't. And then there was one that I should have added into that, which is the community piece. I did talk a little bit about that when I said about coach or mentoring, but there's a lovely line in Brittany's TED Talk about a group of women, I think in Kenya, talking about their sisterhood. This isn't necessarily about a sisterhood, but I've got a peer group of CEOs. I've got a group of my sisters that I lean on, that I talk to. I've got friends and family and networks, and each of them serve slightly different purposes. But having a community around you, you know, the cliche of being a village raises a child. It's true. Having a village around you, having that community around you is really, really helpful to being able to navigate life. And life is, tricky at times. So do find your community, whether that's the alumni at Westminster, whether that's your educational peer group, whether it's a workplace. Do find the community that you need. And then my very final point is, remember that you are enough. It is human nature to feel self-doubt. If you are feeling high levels of anxiety, there is absolutely nothing to be ashamed about. I have taken medication for my mental health. I have a whole strategy around preserving my mental health. I'm incredibly good now at recognizing when my mental health is under strain. That anxiety that we genuinely can feel if we are in that position of a grip of self-doubt, and the elements that Clancy and Imes talked about, we can get help for that. There are things that we can do, and I've talked about some of them today, but there are also, if you are in need of medication, there is nothing to be ashamed of in seeking that help. You wouldn't feel shame if you broke your ankle and you had a plaster cast put on, or you took paracetamol for a toothache. So please don't feel shame if you are suffering poor mental health. There is absolutely nothing for you to feel ashamed of. Self-doubt is human nature. And like I say, you are enough. I hope something in what I've said has been useful to you, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Caron, thank you so much. Honestly, just for me, and I can see by the things that were in the chat, that was just so impactful for all of us, I think. So thank you. There's so much I want to ask you, but there's lots of questions that have come in from the audience too. Thank you, really genuinely thank you. I'm sure everyone on the call found it useful. So we do have questions that have been coming in. So I'm kind of looking at my other screen, so apologies, I'm not looking into the camera, although I am going to use my host's role to ask my question first, or one of my questions. And you did touch on this a bit during the talk, actually, but I wondered if you felt, or you wanted to say anything more about whether there are any positives to experiencing imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I honestly think that fear and all of the emotions that we feel, again, I quote my nan quite a lot, because she was actually quite a font of all knowledge, but she used to say to me that fear and excitement give you the same physiological response. And they do. It's just our mind that gets in the way and starts going, all this adrenaline that's pumping through me is because I want to run away.
Yes.
But equally, when you get that flutter of nerves in your belly, it's just the same flutter of nerves. Well, I don't know, not everyone's husband gives them that flutter of nerves, but when your husband grabs your hand and looks at you in a particular way, that sort of, that excitement is just the same as the fear that you feel when you're about to step onto a stage, or you're about to do something that you haven't encountered before.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. So there's questions that are kind of in groups a little bit, I think, but maybe if I start with some of the questions that are around kind of resources, and obviously you've shared loads there with the TED Talks and the book and all sorts of different things, and we will make sure that you get those links. Were there anything else? So a question did come in that what are the best books, films or podcasts that you could recommend? That was before you got into the TED Talk bit. I wonder if there's anything that you want to add to the things you've shared already.
So yeah, Brene Brown, all of that sort of side, Stephen Covey, all of the ones that I've mentioned so far have been really good. Couple that I haven't mentioned. One is The Universe Has Your Back by Gabriella Bernstein, which I found brilliantly helpful. I had a mentor who I went to thinking, in this sort of self-limiting way that we've just been talking that we can be prone to, I went to her thinking, oh, well, I'm at the end of my role at the CFG, I can't do anything more. I've used all the tools in my toolbox. I perhaps need to hand the baton on. Do all these sound familiar? And she said to me, why are you self-limiting in that way? What is it about this that you're scared of? And what's your purpose? And I couldn't answer the question, what's your purpose? And she recommended that book to me, and we happened to be going on to a holiday of a lifetime in Grenada. Absolutely gorgeous place. Go. Wonderful people. And I sat and watched this read this book and came to the conclusion that my purpose was around bringing love into leadership and really leaning into doing leadership in a different way. And I found that an absolutely transformational read for me. So that's one I'd recommend. The other one that will possibly make you snigger, my husband bought me one year, called Why Won't You Apologise? It wasn't meant it wasn't meant because I don't apologise, but we were having some challenges at the time, particularly around, bringing up teenagers, and I found it incredibly useful. I think the name of the lady is Jane Haver, but I wouldn't swear to it. And that was really helpful in looking at the psychology of an apology. And actually, within the workplace, we need to apologise way more than we ever do, because sorry is the hardest word. It kind of accepts liability. We're told not to accept liability, and actually often it's the most disarming thing you can do is to say, I feel your pain and I'm sorry for my part in it. No if, buts or maybe, even when you don't feel that you've done anything wrong, but genuinely, not I'm sorry if you feel pain, which is a very different thing. And I found it a really, really interesting book to read, to understand how people work and what impact our words can have on people.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So sort of moving on from sort of resources, but I think sort of linked to that, there's a group of questions around sort of tips and bouncing back. And something that came up was, how do you train confidence? I mean, you talked there about confidence as a muscle, and yeah. Brené Brown, I think, talks about that as well. And I mean, there's lots that people can go away and research. But yeah, how do you train confidence, and how do you have any tips on being more confident when you're speaking in front of people and making important decisions alone? That's an interesting one, isn't it, actually? Yeah. So maybe the sort of training confidence and speaking in front of people, and then we could come on to the making decisions.
So definitely watch Amy Cuddy talk, because she was the one that started to help me. I've got a wonderful colleague and quite a mentor figure in a woman called Deborah Alcott-Tyler, who is the Chief Executive Director of Social Change. And I remember our first conversation, I met her right at the beginning of taking on my CEO role. It was my first CEO role. I'd got no director level experience even when I took it on. I'd never run anything. I mean, I say that I'd run a preschool alongside a full-time job, and I'd managed to turn that round. So, she was really helpful in building my confidence. And she said to me, Caron, remember that confidence is all about the first three letters. Con. And I thought, wow, that's a really, really interesting way to think about it. And I'm not saying don't be authentic. That's not what I'm saying. But you can pretend to be confident, to speak with confidence, to watch yourself. I'm sorry, we say an awful lot as women. Oh, I'm sorry, this might be a stupid question, but we're already kind of dumbing ourselves down before, what I'm about to say is of no incidence. And we announce that. So noticing when we do those things and practicing not doing it, practicing being a positive, sort of standing upright when we're in a meeting. If we're feeling lack of confidence and we're about to speak, put our hands on the table and put our shoulders back. Lift your chest. And this isn't a gender thing. This is everyone can do this. Power posing. Like I said, I wasn't joking. I stood in toilets before I was going to meetings with ministers, and I stood and power posed for 2 minutes, meditating, being able to just clear my mind between meetings and let go of, particularly if I've just had a hard call, going for a walk around the block, having a conversation, watching something that makes me laugh. Lots and different things like that. But just literally fake it until you make it, because you will suddenly find you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I would say it does take practice, doesn't it? And you, well, I don't know if you ever stop feeling daft when you're doing the power pose in the toilet, but you kind of start to feel less daft doing it because you know of the positive effect that it's going to have. And absolutely. And those breathing.
I do it in meetings, Caroline.
Yeah.
If I'm having a difficult conversation with someone, you will quite often see me do this.
Yeah.
And it's not, I'm not being arrogant. I'm opening myself up. I'm buying myself some time. I'm shifting my body in order to help me.
I remember listening, I can't remember what it was, but listening, and that was about sort of speaking in meetings, and the person was saying, if you feel you're going to be nervous about speaking, speak early. And I mean, that could be even before the meeting starts. Ask someone to pass you the water. It's a bit different in the virtual world, but you know, do something that gets your voice out there and gets you to hear your voice. And I don't experience this so much now, but certainly, you know, early days of going to committee meetings and big meetings and things, and you would feel like when I speak, my voice is going to crack. I'm not going to be able to do this. Whereas if you've just done that and you've got your voice out there, that I think can be a positive thing.
Okay. So what if it cracks? Who cares if it cracks?
Well, there's also that actually, and that is just so important, isn't it? It's just if it does, it does.
There's a further tip that comes from theatre, because I'm a bit of a drama queen. And what you realise when you are on stage is the audience don't know what your lines are. So what feels like an hour of pause because you've forgotten the line while you improvise and try and think what the next thing is to cover the silence feels terrible to you. You ask the people in the audience afterwards, most of them will go, oh no, didn't notice.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a question about how, and this is sort of, I guess, linked to sort of bouncing back as well, or kind of tips. How can I change my negative thinking in terms of applying for graduate jobs? Every job I look at, they require maths or advanced IT skills. It doesn't fit with my law and anthropology degree. How can I change my approach and outlook?
So I think we are very linear in how we apply for jobs. And again, I don't say this as negative to men, but men do tend to look at what they can do on a job description, whereas women tend to look at what they can't do. And it's, you know, that's human nature. I think that is changing. That's, you know, I don't want to be too stereotypical, but that seems to be borne out by research. I think when we are looking at our job descriptions, we should draw on a wider pool of experience. So the example I will give you is my current role. I was able to talk about my absence of director level skills and leadership from my CV by saying I've been the operationally active chair of a preschool. I've turned it from a failing organisation. Okay, I haven't done it all myself, but I was the chair. We've turned it from being a failing organisation to an outstanding rated Ofsted organisation. We've secured £250,000 to build a purpose-built unit, blah, 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 blah. So I was able to draw on that to show the synergy between my skills and experience that were outside of my work or my course or my education, and draw upon that. I sit on the Audit and Risk Committee of the Church of England's Pension Board. The advert said they wanted a qualified chartered accountant. I'm not a qualified chartered accountant, but I know that I have the skills and knowledge to bring to that. So that's the thing you should write down. What are the skills and knowledge that you bring that job needs? Not what does the job description ask you to bring, and then show them that. And covering letters, the other thing I would say is somebody who employs people, the covering letter is way more important than your CV, but increasingly so. You know, we're part of a movement to not, I shouldn't say this in an institute setting, but to not demand degrees. What we're looking for is what people can bring. So the covering letter saying what you've learned and how you can apply it and what kind of person you are says so much more.
Absolutely. And I mean, actually, some of my teams have been doing some work looking at this person's specifications, and you know, we tend, and perhaps this is because we're a university, but we tend to automatically ask for graduates and don't go into the detail of those other skills, those transferable skills that you can bring. And you know, pretty much everyone on this call is going to end up being a graduate, but we know also that the graduate labour market is very crowded. So it is about showing how you've got something above and beyond your degree, and what those things are that you can bring is just so important. And I might just plug our Westminster Employability Award at that point, because that's a really good way to kind of think about your transferable skills. So, and this sort of starts to segue into another section as well. There is quite a bit, people have been asking quite a bit around sort of ethnicity and the sorts of things that might be in your life that could cause imposter syndrome or increase it. But one particular I sort of honed in on was when you're on the receiving end of discrimination, what tips do you have for not starting to believe, either consciously or subconsciously, that other narrative, that narrative that's coming from other people?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly easy to allow other people's narrative about you to become your truth. So I'm not pretending for one moment this is an easy thing to do, but I think we have to think of ourselves as boats. The thing that sinks a boat is water, but the thing that makes a boat is water. So if you and actually the book that I talked about with Don Miguel Ruiz, with the 4 agreements, he talks about not taking things personally. What other people say about us is their view, good and bad, actually. So if somebody tells you you're wonderful and brilliant, it's just their opinion. You know you, and that's the truth we have to hold on to. And I think particularly in forms of where it's explicit discrimination, firstly, there are protections available, and we must not just ourselves step forward and challenge discrimination, but we must not be witness to discrimination. If we see it happening in others, you know, a bystander, I don't know if you've watched Jess Phillips on the topic of male violence and violence against women. She talks about a bystander. Well, I think the same applies in any situation of disadvantage and discrimination. We owe it to each other to have safe places of work for all of us. You know, there are lots and lots of things that are written on this that I won't, you know, sort of wax lyrical on, but the kind of lines of, if we don't stand up for other people, sometime it's going to be us. So if you don't have any other burning platform on which to put this other than your sort of social justice, then recognise that at some point a bully will bully you, and you need to have allies and people around you who are actively supporting you. So talk to somebody as well. There are plenty of charities out there that deal with mental health, that deal with bullying, that deal with your human and employment and other rights, and will be advocates for you. So you are never alone. Even if you think you're alone, there are always other communities that you can tap into, even if you don't have a friendship circle or you feel very isolated. You're never alone, however desperate it might feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you talked as well about that importance of that network, and, you know, whether that's the sisterhood, whatever that is, but having that, and that might be a friendship circle, it might be something different, it might be charities, but just knowing where your support networks are generally is so important. But certainly if you are in a situation where you are sensing that you're experiencing discrimination, then it's just really, really important to reach out and to get that advice from other people, I think, and then to move ahead with the kind of appropriate processes. You mentioned mental health there, Caron, and that's come up quite a bit as well, and whether imposter syndrome affects our mental health. Would you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think it is part of our mental health. You know, I think anything that makes us feel less than is on a spectrum of on one end brilliant mental health and on the other end appalling mental health. So imposter syndrome, because it's about our anxieties, the way we feel, the feeling of not fitting in, of not living up to other people's expectations, of course it's about mental health. So if you feel these things and you don't address it, my one sort of massive primary lesson from suffering a breakdown is, if you think you can just push through some of this stuff, you can't. You know, your body will end up saying, you're not listening to me, and it will floor you. In my particular case, I was probably 3 or 4 weeks of limping along, having really lost my grip for several times. And I remember vividly the moment at which I just completely lost it and I couldn't get it back. And I was in the workplace. I literally, one of my colleagues was particularly unpleasant to me as a result of the stress and pressure that he was under. And I literally just said, I'm going to have to bring that conversation to an end now. And I got up. I didn't didn't do anything, got up, got my bag, walked out of the office just to take a breather and lost it and could not bring it back again. Literally cried constantly for about a month, I think. Just could not get myself back under control. And that was my body saying, you are not listening. 16 and 20-hour days is not the way that this is going to be resolved, and this will end in your death if you don't do something about it. So, you know, this is, imposter syndrome is mental health. It is all about mental health. And you need to look after that just as much as you brush your teeth or you, you know, wash your hair or put fuel in your body through eating and drinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a breakdown in a workplace situation, but again, you know, it's it's something that's coming, isn't it? And then there is a moment which just tips you over the edge. And yeah, I cried for a very long time, but I learned so much from that. And it is learning those early signals, and it's similar to any sort of physical injury. I also have, you know, chronic back pain, and I know when my back does that very first tweak, that's when I have to start to rest. And it's trying to apply that to our mental health. Society doesn't, it is changing, but society hasn't traditionally encouraged us to do that. And we have kind of, the approach has been, yeah, you just power through and you'll get there. But in fact, that doesn't do anyone any good at all. So no, yeah, I completely, yeah, that's really, really resonates with me.
I would also say that I was absolutely paralyzed with fear coming back to work after a breakdown, that it would mean the end of my career, that no one would want to employ me. And I went for a couple of CEO jobs while I was I am at CFG, but over the last few years, not driven by my mental health, but driven by this sort of sense that I'd achieved all I could achieve for the organisation and didn't get them. And at the back of my mind, every time would be this lift of, is it because, and actually, no, it wasn't. It was because it wasn't the right job for me. And it was no verdict on my abilities. It was that I was not the right fit for that particular role. And actually, I don't want to do a CEO role. I didn't want to do a CEO role for the two that I went for, but I convinced myself that's what I needed to do to perform to other people's expectations of climbing ladders. And now I'm not trying to perform to other people's expectations. I'm trying to perform to my own expectations.
Yes, that's a really important distinction. A couple of other things under the sort of understanding imposter syndrome better. There's been quite a bit, and you picked up on the BME, BAME questions, but there is a question or a few questions around, is ethnicity a significant predictor of imposter syndrome? So that's how the question's been asked. I wonder what your response or kind of thinking about that is.
Well, my answer is I don't know, but there are definitely papers on it. When I was doing a bit of looking for some additional materials for today, there were definitely papers that talked about the differences between different ethnicities. There were also different papers that say that actually it's got nothing to do with our gender or our ethnicity or our sexual orientation or anything else, that we all at various different points feel somewhere on the spectrum of imposter syndrome. And in some ways, again, talking about Deborah, she's shared a piece that she'd written that said, stop talking about imposter syndrome. It's not, you know, it's terrible. Why do we do this? And I think that's a valid point as well. You know, sometimes I think that we tend to think of this as being your problem. When you've got a syndrome, if I've got a poorly knee, it's my poorly knee that I've got to deal with. Whereas actually most of the situations in which we feel self-doubt in a crippling way is not about us. I'd say the vast majority is not about us. It's about the environment in which we're operating, and it's our response to a negative stimuli. So in that extent, I would personally express a view, whether it's academically backed up or not, that we know that there is greater disadvantage experienced by our colleagues who are people of colour, our colleagues who are LGBTQ+, you know, our colleagues who are disabled. We know that those exist, otherwise there would not be legislation to try and address the disadvantage. We know on the research post-COVID that the people that suffered the most during the pandemic were people who were already in marginalised and minoritized groups. So, you know, I think it naturally follows that the people that are probably on the sharp end of some of this stress response, imposter syndrome, are going to be from those groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that really struck me, Caron, when you were talking about the idea that, it's out there in our environment. And I'd never thought of it in that way, but in the way that we've still got a long way to go, but I think we have got more effective as a society about thinking about the fact that our physical world, our buildings, is what disables people rather than a physical condition that they've got. It's a similar kind of take, I think, isn't it? And it's maybe this isn't about what's in me, maybe it's about what's out there in the world and what I'm being expected to do, or the environment that I'm needing to perform in. So, question which is sort of linked to this: what if you apologise all the time because of your imposter syndrome? I've been told to stop saying sorry all the time at work. How do you balance this? And again, you did touch on this a little bit, but do you want to say a bit more about that?
Oh, well, it's very hard. I still do it. I still say, oh, sorry. I still qualify things when I speak. I'm not saying that any of this is easy, but trying to notice, and then once you've noticed, you've tuned into it. It's incredibly difficult then, once you're aware of something, to carry on doing it. So I know, for example, that sometimes when I'm speaking to people, I'll go, and I'll hear myself say, and once I've heard myself say, I then keep hearing myself say, and then I start making a real effort to suppress that kind of drumbeat, almost like a pause that appears in my a connector between my words. So once we're aware that we do it, it becomes easier to be disciplined to try and stop ourselves from doing it, but also ask for help. Your colleagues that are friends, supporters, allies, why not ask them? Pick me up when I say sorry. You're doing it again. Let's have a little signal that says stop it. And I think then we can try to do that. But I would be more worried about it being the expression of that feeling of imposter syndrome than the actual physical I'm saying sorry. So trying to go back up. Was it Desmond Tutu that said we've got to stop worrying about pulling the people out of the river and go further upstream and find why the bodies are falling in? That's the bit I'd say here. Go back up the line. Why are you saying sorry? Can you unpick some of that stuff for yourself? And then just go through some of the things that we were talking about tonight about, is this something you feel negative about because people have put you down for it? In which case, can you go through some personal reconciliation with that and start to love yourself, work on you loving yourself? That doesn't mean that I think I'm perfect. I don't, but I do love myself. I can genuinely now say that I look at myself in the mirror and go, yes, I love you, even though I know you can be an egotistical idiot at times and clumsy and silly, but I do love myself. And by loving myself, I can then love others. And that becomes, I think, a much more healthy state of mind.
Yeah, and it's the oxygen mask thing again, isn't it? It's that, look after yourself first. Okay, couple just to finish up with. So do you have any suggestions or ideas for exercises that could help overcome imposter syndrome? I mean, actually, the power stance is a bit like that, I guess, but are there other things that you might suggest?
I really swear by meditation. I don't do it all the time. I probably should do it more than I do, but I do it through, I use it almost as like a plaster when I get a cut, or a hot bath when I've got sore muscles. So I will meditate as and when I need it, and I also will carve out space to do things that are breathing spaces for myself. Whether that's reading a book or laying in a hammock or going for a walk or having a bath. Try not to do too much of the reaching for a glass of wine as my moment for myself, because that also can become quite negative. Brene Brown talks about strategic breathing. So breathing in for 4, holding it for 4, breathing out for 4, holding it for 4, or imagining a box and doing that around the lines. Breathing is incredibly useful. The tactic that I used to use with my kids before I knew any about this, but now that I reflect back on it, I see where that is imagining a white room, and the anxiety is a black spot, finding a door and shoveling it out and then shutting the door. And that sort of real visual, or even better, again, I did this with my kids, writing it down on a piece of paper and then getting rid of the piece of paper, throwing it away. There's something very cathartic about that physicality of going, you're gone, listening to good music, laughing, doing things that make you feel up. When I was through my, in the grips of my breakdown, my then chair, Ian Theodorson, who's a fantastic man, absolutely love him to bits, was the CFO at the Church of England. And he said to me, what are you doing to fill up your bath? And I thought, what on earth are you talking about, Ian? He said, imagine that your life is a bath. When we're stressed, that's the water running in. When we're stressed, the plug's out. The good things are the tap being turned on. And when we're feeling stressed or feeling anxious, we tend to do things that withdraw us. So we stop going out to see our friends. We don't have time to do something for us because we've got that piece of work to do that we're angsting about. And we stop filling up our bath, but we don't put the plug back in. So if you've got water pouring in at a lesser rate than it's pouring out, you end up sitting on the bottom of a cold, empty bath. And that was his notion. Do things that is counterintuitive. When I was in the middle of the grip of it all and I was doing ridiculously long hours, he said to me, you need to fill up your bath. So I went and auditioned for a part in a film. So I did a part in a film in the middle of all this sort of nightmare. But actually that was part of my recovery and part of my ability to now feel a little bit more healthy. It was a distraction. It was something that forced me to spend time doing something else. So I don't know if any of those help.
Yeah, no, that's all really great. Thank you. I'm sure people, and I can see things coming up, the really great things coming up in the use a self-soothe box where you put things in a box to support your senses. And I can remember, one of the things I use if I feel my anxiety is very bad is what can I smell, what can I touch, what can I taste? Just really tuning into your senses can really make a huge difference. So Caron, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to round up with a final question, which is a bit unfair in a way, really. But one of the questions that came in is, okay, so how do you overcome imposter syndrome overall? So, if in 30 seconds you could just tell us, I mean, obviously you can't, but I guess is there a sort of parting something that you might want to share?
Well, I think for me, the main lesson that I want everyone to take away and to say to themselves, write it on a piece of paper, stick it on your mirror, put it next to your laptop, whatever, you are enough. And if you say it to yourself over and over and over, you can only do your best, and your best is not going to be a static thing. It will be better on days when you're feeling really good and in flow, and on other days it will be less, but you're still doing your best and you are enough. And if you tell yourself that enough times, you do actually start to believe it. And that, that's the biggest lesson that I think we have to take away from this, is to love ourselves and say we are enough.
That is the perfect note to end on. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It is all we've got time for. Caron, it's just been wonderful. I really can't thank you enough. There's going to be a link that appears in the chat. It might have appeared already because I've lost the sight of that bit of chat, for a short evaluation form. Yep, there it is. And we really would appreciate people filling that out. It just helps us plan events for the future. So please do take some time to fill that out. As we mentioned at the beginning, we will be emailing round the link to the YouTube recording, so keep an eye out for that. That will come through. And I think someone posted the YouTube channel for What It Takes earlier as well. And really just to say that was the final talk for semester 1, and what a great one to end on. The series will resume in February, so once we're into semester 2. So everyone do keep checking online for details, and really looking forward to seeing you at an event in the future. So thanks again, Caron, from all of us, and a big virtual round of applause for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.